The man who destroyed my life wasn't a stranger. He was the one person I trusted without hesitation. The one who knew my history, my fears, my ambitions, and every mistake I had ever tried to bury. For 22 years, he stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, through every success and every failure, through late-night conversations and early morning plans that felt like they would carry us into a future we both believed we owned. I remember the night everything ended, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because of how quiet it felt. The rain fell steadily on a street that had once felt like home, and the only sound I could truly hear was my own breathing, uneven and heavy, as I sat there trying to understand how my life had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Across the street, he stood still, watching, not saying a word, not stepping forward, not even pretending to be surprised. In that moment, I realized something I would spend years trying to accept. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something planned, something deliberate, something he had decided long before I ever saw it coming. The handcuffs closed around my wrists with a finality that echoed louder than the sirens, and as they led me away, I kept looking back, waiting for him to speak, to explain, to do anything that would prove I was wrong about what I was beginning to understand. But he didn't move. He just watched. And that was the moment I knew the truth was going to be far worse than anything I could imagine. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about betrayal, it's a story about how trust can be used as a weapon, how the person closest to you can become the reason everything falls apart, and how sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one that's been right in front of you the entire time. There are moments in life that don't feel real until much later, moments that pass quickly but leave a mark that never really fades. For me, that moment didn't begin with the police or the accusations or even the night I lost everything. It began years earlier, in a place that felt safe, with a friendship that seemed unbreakable. His name was Ethan Carter, and if you had asked anyone who knew us back then, they would have told you the same thing. We were inseparable. We met when we were young, long before life became complicated, long before money and responsibilities started shaping the decisions we made. Back then, everything felt simple. We shared the same dreams, the same hunger to build something meaningful, something that would give us the kind of life we used to talk about when we had nothing but time and ambition. Ethan had a way of making people believe in him. It wasn't just confidence, it was something deeper, something that made you feel like he understood things before anyone else did. He could walk into a room and within minutes have everyone listening, not because he demanded attention, but because people wanted to hear what he had to say. And for years, I believed in him the same way everyone else did, maybe even more. I trusted him with decisions that shaped my future, with opportunities that could change everything, and eventually with responsibilities that most people would never hand over to anyone else. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, built over time, reinforced by small moments that made it feel natural, like there was no reason to question anything. Looking back now, I can see the details I missed, the conversations that felt harmless at the time but carried a weight I didn't understand. There were moments when he would take control of a situation without asking, moments when he would speak on my behalf before I even had a chance to respond, moments that should have made me pause, if only for a second. But I didn't pause. I didn't question it, because why would I? This was the person who had been there through everything, the person who had never given me a reason to doubt him, at least not one I was willing to acknowledge. As the years passed, our lives became more intertwined, not just personally, but professionally. We built something together, something that started small but quickly grew into something neither of us had imagined when we first talked about it. It was more than just a business. It was proof that everything we had worked for meant something, that all those late nights and early mornings had been worth it. And with that growth came new opportunities, bigger risks, and decisions that carried consequences far beyond anything we had faced before. That was when things began to shift, not in a way that was obvious, not in a way that would raise immediate concern, but in small, subtle ways that only make sense when you look back on them with the clarity of hindsight. There were deals he insisted on handling himself, details he would simplify when I asked questions, explanations that sounded convincing enough to move forward without hesitation. He would remind me of how far we had come, how much we had already achieved, and how this next step could change everything for us. And I believed him because that's what trust does. It removes doubt, it fills in the gaps, it convinces you that the person standing next to you has your best interest at heart, even when the reality is something entirely different. The night everything changed didn't feel like the beginning of something. It felt like the end of something I didn't even know was breaking. I remember the sound of the knock at the door, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet in a way that immediately felt wrong. By the time I opened it, there were already too many people standing there, too many questions being asked, too many assumptions being made before I even had a chance to understand what was happening. They spoke in terms I didn't fully process at first, words like investigation, fraud, financial misconduct, words that didn't belong in my life, words that felt disconnected from everything I thought I knew. And then I saw him, not beside me, not stepping forward to explain, but standing at a distance, watching the entire thing unfold as if he were just another observer, as if none of this had anything to do with him. I kept waiting for him to speak, for him to step in, for him to say something that would bring everything back to reality, something that would make it clear this was all a mistake. But he didn't. He stayed where he was, silent, still, and in that silence, everything started to make sense in a way that felt impossible to accept. Because in that moment, I wasn't just losing my freedom, or my reputation, or everything I had spent years building. I was losing something far deeper than that. I was losing the belief that I understood the people closest to me, the belief that loyalty meant something, the belief that trust was something you could rely on. And as they led me away, as the distance between us grew with every step, I realized that the person who could have stopped it all, the person who had the power to change everything in that moment, had already made his decision long before I ever saw it coming. What started as loyalty ended in silence, in lies that were told so calmly they felt like truth, and in a setup so precise that by the time anyone noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to undo it. The story you're about to hear centers around two men who spent more than 2 decades building a bond that most people would call unbreakable. Marcus Hale and Ethan Carter were not just friends. They were partners in every sense of the word, tied together by history, by shared struggles, and by a future they believed they were creating side by side. From the outside, their lives looked like the kind people admire, the kind people assume is built on trust and mutual respect. But what no one saw, not even Marcus, was how that same trust could be reshaped into something else entirely, something that would eventually become the very thing used against him. At the center of it all was a business deal, one that seemed like the natural next step for two men who had already proven they could succeed together. It promised growth, stability, and a level of success that would secure everything they had worked for over the years. Ethan was the one who brought it forward, the one who explained the opportunity in a way that made it feel not just possible but necessary. He spoke with the same confidence Marcus had relied on for years, the same certainty that had guided them through countless decisions before. And once again, Marcus did what he had always done. He trusted him. What makes this story different, what makes it harder to understand, is that this wasn't just a mistake or a bad decision. It felt intentional, calculated in a way that suggested this wasn't something that happened suddenly, but something that had been forming quietly over time. That leaves us with questions that don't have simple answers, questions that become more unsettling the deeper you look into them. Who really betrayed who, and at what point did that betrayal begin? Was this something that Ethan Carter had planned from the start, or did it grow out of something smaller, something that slowly changed into something far more damaging? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, the one that continues to linger long after everything else is understood, is why he didn't stop it when he had the chance. Because there were moments, more than one, where everything could have been different, where a single word from him could have prevented what happened next. But he stayed silent, and that silence would go on to shape everything that followed in ways Marcus Hale would spend years trying to fully comprehend. Long before the night Marcus Hale found himself sitting on that cold curb with everything slipping through his hands, there was a version of his life that felt steady, earned, and real in a way that only comes from years of hard work. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who expected anything to be handed to him. He grew up in a quiet, working-class neighborhood where nothing came easy and everything had to be built from the ground up. The kind of place where people measured success not by how much you had, but by how much you were willing to sacrifice to get there. From an early age, Marcus understood responsibility. He worked jobs most people tried to avoid, took on burdens that weren't always his to carry, and learned quickly that consistency mattered more than talent. That mindset stayed with him, shaping the man he would become, someone reliable, someone people could depend on, someone who believed that loyalty was not just a word but a commitment you lived by every day. Daniel Brooks entered Marcus's life at a time when everything still felt open, when the future wasn't defined yet and the choices they made seemed limitless. Where Marcus was grounded and steady, Daniel was different in a way that drew people in immediately. He had a natural confidence that didn't need to be forced, the kind that made people listen even when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. Daniel understood how to navigate situations, how to read people, and how to position himself in a way that always seemed just a step ahead. It wasn't something Marcus questioned, it was something he admired. Together, they balanced each other in a way that felt natural. Marcus brought discipline and work ethic, while Daniel brought vision and direction, and over time, that combination became the foundation of everything they built. Their friendship wasn't built overnight. It grew through shared experiences, through moments that most people would recognize as the kind that define lifelong bonds. There were long nights spent talking about what they wanted out of life, early mornings chasing opportunities that didn't always work out, and countless setbacks that could have pulled them apart, but instead brought them closer. They celebrated small wins like they were major victories, and when things went wrong, they faced it together without hesitation. To anyone watching from the outside, they were the kind of friends people wished they had, the kind that seemed immune to the kind of problems that break other relationships. And for a long time, Marcus believed that was true. As they got older, their ambitions started to take shape in more concrete ways. What began as ideas and conversations slowly turned into action, and eventually into something real. They started small, like most people do, taking risks that felt manageable, learning from mistakes, and building something piece by piece. It wasn't always smooth, and there were moments where failure felt closer than success, but they kept moving forward. Marcus trusted Daniel's instincts, especially when it came to decisions that required a level of confidence he didn't always feel himself. And Daniel, in turn, relied on Marcus to execute, to bring structure to ideas that might have otherwise remained just that. Over time, their partnership became more than just a collaboration. It became a system where each of them played a role the other depended on. As their business grew, so did the level of trust between them. Marcus began to rely on Daniel not just as a partner, but as someone who could make decisions on his behalf without needing constant oversight. It wasn't something he thought about deeply, it just felt like the natural progression of a relationship built over years of shared success. Daniel handled conversations Marcus wasn't always part of, managed details that didn't always get explained in full, and took control of situations in a way that seemed efficient rather than concerning. If anything, Marcus saw it as a strength. It allowed him to focus on what he did best, while Daniel handled the rest. It felt like balance, like a system that worked because it had been tested over time. But when you look closely, when you go back and examine those years with the kind of clarity that only comes after everything has fallen apart, there are moments that stand out in a different way. Small things, almost unnoticeable at the time, that begin to carry a different weight when seen from another perspective. There were times when Daniel would answer questions directed at Marcus before he even had the chance to speak, finishing his sentences in a way that seemed harmless, even helpful. There were conversations about money where Daniel's tone would shift slightly, just enough to suggest he was thinking a few steps ahead, but not enough to raise concern. There were decisions that were presented as already resolved, as if the discussion had happened somewhere else at another time without Marcus being fully aware of it. None of these moments felt significant on their own. They were easy to overlook, easy to justify, especially when everything else seemed to be working. Success has a way of quieting doubt, of making you focus on results rather than process. And for Marcus, the results were there. Their business was growing, their lives were improving, and the future they had once talked about felt closer than ever. So he didn't question it. He didn't stop to analyze the patterns or the subtle shifts in how decisions were being made. He trusted Daniel the same way he always had, fully and without hesitation, because to do anything else would have meant questioning something he had built his life around. There was also something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore once you notice it. A quiet tension that would surface in certain moments, not through arguments or disagreements, but through silence, through the way Daniel would look at Marcus when certain topics came up, especially anything related to control, ownership, or long-term plans. It wasn't obvious enough to cause conflict, but it was there, lingering just beneath the surface. At the time, Marcus interpreted it as pressure, as the natural stress that comes with building something meaningful. But in reality, it was something else entirely, something that hinted at a shift in perspective, a change in how Daniel viewed not just the business but their relationship as a whole. Marcus's loyalty never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger as their lives became more intertwined. He trusted Daniel with decisions that affected not just their business, but his personal life, his finances, and the future of his family. There were documents he signed without hesitation, agreements he accepted without fully dissecting, and risks he took because Daniel assured him it was the right move. And each time it reinforced the same belief that they were in this together, that whatever happened, they would face it side by side just like they always had. What makes this part of the story so difficult to process is how normal everything felt at the time. There was no clear moment where things shifted dramatically, no obvious turning point where Marcus could say this is where it all went wrong. Instead, it was a series of small steps, each one building on the last, each one leading them closer to something Marcus couldn't yet see. It's only when you step back, when you piece together those moments with the knowledge of what comes next, that a different picture begins to form, one that suggests the foundation of their partnership may not have been as solid as it appeared. Looking back, the signs were there, scattered across years of conversations, decisions, and moments that didn't quite fit but were never questioned. Marcus can see them clearly now, the way Daniel positioned himself, the way control slowly shifted, the way trust was used in ways he never expected. But at the time, he didn't see it because he wasn't looking for it. He was living in a version of reality where loyalty meant protection, where friendship meant honesty, and where the person standing next to him would never be the reason everything fell apart. Looking back, the signs were there. I just didn't know I was already part of his plan. The opportunity didn't arrive with warning signs or hesitation. It came dressed as everything Marcus Hale had been working toward for years. By the time Daniel Brooks brought it to the table, it already felt like the next logical step, the kind of move that separates people who stay comfortable from those who take control of their future. It wasn't just another deal, it was bigger, faster, and more complex than anything they had handled before, involving numbers that carried weight and decisions that couldn't be undone once they were made. Daniel presented it with the same confidence Marcus had relied on for decades, walking him through the potential outcomes, the projected returns, and the doors it could open if everything went according to plan. There was a certainty in the way he spoke, a sense that he had already thought through every angle, every risk, every possible outcome. And when Marcus hesitated, even slightly, Daniel didn't push aggressively. He leaned in just enough to remind him of how far they had come and how this was the moment that could define everything that came next. He told me it was our breakthrough, that this was the moment everything would change, and the way he said it made it feel less like a possibility and more like a fact waiting to happen. Marcus wanted to believe that, not because he was reckless, but because the story made sense. They had built something strong, they had earned the right to take a step forward, and Daniel had never led them in the wrong direction before. So when it came time to commit, to move from discussion into action, Marcus did what he had always done. He trusted him. The paperwork was extensive, more detailed than anything they had dealt with in the past, filled with language that felt technical and layered in a way that wasn't immediately clear. Marcus asked questions, but not enough, and when Daniel responded, it was always with the same steady assurance that there was nothing to worry about. "Trust me," he said, not once but multiple times, each repetition making it easier to move forward without digging deeper. As the deal progressed, small things began to feel slightly out of place, not enough to stop everything, but enough to create a quiet sense that something wasn't fully aligned. There were documents Marcus didn't completely understand, sections that seemed rushed, and explanations that felt simplified in a way that left gaps he didn't know how to fill. Daniel handled most of the communication, often taking calls late at night, stepping away to speak in private, and returning with updates that sounded complete but lacked the kind of detail Marcus had been used to in the past. When Marcus asked to be included, Daniel reassured him it wasn't necessary, that it was more efficient this way, that he was taking care of everything behind the scenes so Marcus wouldn't have to carry the burden. It sounded reasonable, especially given how much Daniel had already proven himself, but there was a shift in how information was shared, a subtle change that made Marcus more of an observer than an equal participant. The closer they got to finalizing the deal, the more that distance seemed to grow. Decisions were made faster, timelines became tighter, and there was a sense of urgency that didn't leave much room for hesitation. Marcus found himself signing documents with less discussion than before, agreeing to terms that felt heavier than anything they had committed to in the past. Each time he paused, even briefly, Daniel would step in with reassurance, reminding him of the bigger picture, the long-term gain, and the fact that they had navigated challenges like this before. And each time, Marcus pushed aside the doubt, convincing himself that this was simply what growth looked like, that discomfort was part of progress, and that questioning too much could cost them the opportunity altogether. The night everything changed didn't begin with chaos. It began with a knock that felt too urgent to ignore. It was late, the kind of late where silence settles into the walls of a home and every unexpected sound carries weight. When Marcus opened the door, he was met with a presence that immediately felt wrong. Not because of what was said at first, but because of how quickly everything escalated from confusion to accusation. There were too many people, too many questions, and a tone that suggested they already believed they knew the answers. Words like fraud and embezzlement were used with a certainty that didn't leave room for explanation, as if the conclusion had already been reached before Marcus even had the chance to respond. Inside the house, everything shifted at once. His wife's voice broke under the pressure of what was happening, her confusion turning into fear as the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The sound of movement, of doors opening, of people stepping into spaces that were meant to be private, created a sense of exposure that Marcus had never experienced before. Outside, the quiet of the neighborhood was replaced with attention. Neighbors watching from a distance, drawn by the flashing lights and the kind of scene that turns ordinary moments into something people remember long after it's over. Marcus tried to make sense of it, to piece together how something like this could be happening, but every attempt to explain was met with more certainty from the people standing in front of him. And then he saw Daniel Brooks, not in the center of the situation, not stepping forward to clarify or defend, but standing off to the side, just far enough to avoid being part of the immediate chaos, yet close enough to witness every second of it. His expression didn't match the moment. There was no visible shock, no urgency to intervene, no sign that he was trying to correct a misunderstanding. He was calm, composed, and completely still, as if he had already accepted everything that was happening as inevitable. Marcus locked eyes with him, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the situation, some indication that this was all a mistake that was about to be fixed. I kept waiting for him to say something, to step forward and tell them it wasn't true, to explain that there had been some kind of misunderstanding in the paperwork, some error in the process, something that would bring everything back into focus. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even attempt to interrupt what was unfolding. And in that silence, something inside Marcus shifted in a way that words can't fully capture. Because it wasn't just the accusations, or the fear, or the overwhelming realization that his life was being pulled apart in front of him. It was the understanding that the one person who could have changed everything in that moment had already chosen not to. As the handcuffs were placed around his wrists, as he was led away from the only life he had known, Marcus looked back one last time, holding on to a final hope that Daniel would break his silence, that he would step forward and stop it all before it went too far. But he didn't. He stayed exactly where he was, watching without reaction, without explanation, without any sign that he intended to do anything at all. But he didn't say a word. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded piece by piece, each day stripping away something Marcus Hale had spent years building until there was almost nothing left to hold on to. The first thing to go was his sense of normalcy, replaced by a routine he didn't recognize, one defined by questions, restrictions, and a constant pressure that followed him everywhere he went. His work, the thing he had poured so much of himself into, was no longer his to return to. Calls stopped coming in, messages went unanswered, and people who once relied on him began to distance themselves in ways that felt quiet but deliberate. Reputation, something that takes years to earn and only moments to lose, disappeared faster than he could process, replaced by a narrative that painted him as someone entirely different from the man he knew himself to be. At home, the strain became impossible to ignore. Conversations that once felt easy were now heavy with uncertainty, filled with questions Marcus couldn't answer in a way that made sense even to himself. His wife tried to understand, but the weight of what was happening pressed into every part of their lives, turning doubt into something that lingered in the background of even the simplest moments. It wasn't just about what had happened, It was about what it meant, about whether the man she had trusted was truly who she believed he was. Marcus could see it in her eyes, the conflict between wanting to believe him and the reality of everything pointing in the opposite direction. And the more time passed, the harder it became to hold onto the version of truth he was trying to defend. Outside of his personal life, the story took on a life of its own. Media coverage framed the situation in a way that left little room for interpretation, reducing years of hard work and integrity into a series of accusations presented as fact. Headlines didn't ask questions, they made statements, and those statements shaped how people saw him long before any real answers were uncovered. To the public, Marcus Hale was no longer a hard-working man who built something from the ground up. He was the face of a scandal, a cautionary example of what happens when trust is misplaced, even though the reality was far more complicated than anyone was willing to consider. As the investigation began to take shape, the evidence presented against him appeared solid, structured in a way that made it difficult to argue against. There were documents bearing his signature, agreements that linked him directly to decisions now being questioned, and financial records that traced a path leading back to him with a level of precision that felt impossible to deny. Each piece on its own might have been explainable, but together they formed a narrative that was hard to dismantle. Marcus found himself trying to understand how something he had been part of could look so different when viewed through the lens of an investigation, how actions that once felt routine could now be interpreted as intentional wrongdoing. The questions surrounding his involvement began to shift from what happened to how it happened, and whether there had been warning signs he failed to recognize. Was Marcus careless in ways he hadn't considered at the time, too quick to trust, too willing to move forward without fully understanding the risks? Did he unknowingly sign documents that carried consequences he didn't fully grasp, placing himself in a position where responsibility fell entirely on his shoulders? Or was there something else? Something hidden beneath the surface that hadn't yet been uncovered? A factor that could change the entire direction of the case if it came to light? These possibilities created a layer of doubt that lingered over everything, not just for those investigating the situation, but for Marcus himself. And then there was Daniel Brooks. His absence became as noticeable as his presence once had been. Where he had once been involved in every detail, every decision, every conversation, he now seemed distant, unreachable in ways that didn't match the urgency of what was happening. Attempts to contact him were met with delays, vague responses, or silence altogether. When he did speak, his words were carefully chosen, offering just enough information to appear cooperative without revealing anything substantial. To the authorities, he presented himself as someone willing to assist, someone who was simply providing clarity in a complicated situation. But to Marcus, that cooperation felt different. It felt calculated, controlled, and entirely disconnected from the loyalty that had once defined their relationship. During questioning, the tone shifted in a way Marcus couldn't ignore. The focus narrowed, the assumptions became more direct, and the line between inquiry and accusation began to blur. At one point, a detective leaned forward and said something that would stay with Marcus long after the conversation ended. "Your friend says you handled everything." The words didn't come with hesitation, they were delivered with certainty, as if they were part of a larger framework that had already been established. In that moment, something became clear in a way that left no room for doubt. That's when I realized he wasn't just silent. He was helping them. The weight of that realization didn't hit all at once. It settled in slowly, reshaping everything Marcus thought he understood about the situation. It wasn't just about being left to face the consequences alone. It was about the possibility that those consequences had been directed toward him from the very beginning. Every document, every decision, every step that led to this point began to take on a different meaning, one that suggested a level of intent Marcus had never considered before. And the more he thought about it, the harder it became to dismiss the idea that this had been designed to unfold exactly the way it was happening. Then, just as the case seemed to be moving in a direction that felt inevitable, something surfaced that didn't fit the narrative as cleanly as everything else. It wasn't obvious at first, just a detail buried within a larger collection of records. Something easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention. But once it was noticed, it raised questions that couldn't be ignored, questions that pointed toward a version of events that had yet to be fully explored. It was an email, one that hadn't been part of the original evidence, one that suggested communication happening outside of what had been disclosed up to that point. And that's when everything started to change. The email didn't look important at first glance, just another piece of communication buried in a long chain of messages tied to the deal Marcus Hale had trusted Daniel Brooks to handle. But the more it was examined, the more it stood out, not because of what it said openly, but because of what it implied. The timestamps didn't align with the version of events Daniel had given, and the recipients included names Marcus had never heard before, people who had been involved in decisions he was told were already finalized. It suggested a level of coordination that extended beyond what had been disclosed, a network of communication operating parallel to everything Marcus thought he understood. Once investigators began pulling on that thread, more inconsistencies started to surface, each one small on its own but together forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The documents that once appeared solid began to shift under closer scrutiny. Signatures that were assumed to be straightforward raised questions about how and when they had been applied. Certain agreements contained revisions that Marcus couldn't recall ever reviewing, sections that had been altered in ways that redirected responsibility without drawing attention to the change itself. Financial transactions that initially pointed directly at Marcus began to reveal a more complex route, one that showed funds being moved through multiple channels before landing in places that didn't connect back to him in any direct way. It wasn't enough to immediately clear his name, but it was enough to disrupt the narrative that had been built so confidently against him. As the investigation widened, the focus slowly began to shift, not away from Marcus entirely, but toward the possibility that he had not been acting alone, or more accurately, that he had been positioned to appear as if he were. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that someone had been managing the flow of information, controlling what was visible and what remained hidden. And at the center of that control was Daniel Brooks, the one person who had been involved in every stage of the deal, the one who had access to every document, every account, every decision that had led to this point. The same man who had stood in silence while everything fell apart now appeared in a very different light, one that suggested his role had been far more significant than anyone had initially considered. The truth didn't arrive in a single moment. It formed gradually, built from pieces that only made sense once they were placed together in the right order. Daniel hadn't just been part of the process, he had shaped it. The altered documents, the rerouted transactions, the carefully managed communication, all of it pointed to a level of planning that went beyond opportunity and into intention. Marcus wasn't just involved in what happened. He had been positioned at the center of it in a way that ensured he would carry the full weight of the consequences. The realization was difficult to accept, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because of what it meant about someone he had trusted for most of his life. He didn't just betray me, he needed me to fall. That thought stayed with Marcus as everything continued to unfold, as each new detail reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't about a single decision or a moment of desperation. It was something deeper, something rooted in motives that had likely existed long before the deal ever came into the picture. Jealousy played a role, though it wasn't the kind that shows itself openly. It was subtle, built over time, shaped by years of comparison and quiet competition. Control was another factor, the need to manage outcomes, to dictate the direction of events in a way that ensured a specific result. And beneath it all, there were signs of pressure, financial strain that Daniel had never fully disclosed, obligations that may have pushed him toward choices he couldn't reverse once they were set in motion. When Marcus finally came face to face with Daniel, it wasn't the confrontation he had imagined during the long months of uncertainty. There was no immediate explosion of emotion, no raised voices or dramatic accusations. Instead, there was a controlled tension, a quiet understanding that everything that needed to be said had already been revealed through the evidence. Marcus looked at him, searching for something that might still make sense of it all, something that could explain how a friendship built over decades had led to this point. The word came out steady, but carried the weight of everything Marcus had lost. Daniel didn't look away. He didn't hesitate or attempt to deflect the question. When he responded, his voice was calm, almost detached, as if he were explaining something simple rather than addressing the collapse of a life they had once shared. Because you trusted me. There was no anger in his tone, no visible regret, just a statement delivered with a level of certainty that made it clear he had already accepted what he had done. In that moment, Marcus understood something that went beyond the details of the case, beyond the documents and the transactions and the carefully constructed setup. Trust had been the key to everything, the one element that made the entire plan possible, the one thing Marcus had given freely without ever considering it could be used against him. But even then, as clear as everything seemed, as complete as the picture appeared to be, there was still something missing, a piece of the story that hadn't fully come into focus. Because as much as Daniel Brooks had orchestrated, as much as he had controlled, there were still questions that didn't have answers, details that didn't align perfectly with the version of events now being uncovered. But even then, that wasn't the whole truth. The final pieces didn't fall into place all at once, and even when they did, they didn't bring the kind of closure Marcus Hale thought they would. By then, the truth had already taken too much, and whatever remained felt less like resolution and more like understanding something that could never be undone. What investigators uncovered in the final stages of the case changed the direction of everything once again. Not by clearing Daniel Brooks completely or shifting all the blame elsewhere, but by revealing that the story was larger than either of them had allowed themselves to believe. The transactions, the altered documents, the hidden communication, they didn't just point to Daniel's involvement, they pointed beyond him, to connections that had been carefully concealed, to individuals who had remained in the background while everything unfolded in the foreground. At first, it didn't make sense. Daniel had access, control, and motive, all the elements needed to orchestrate what happened. But there were details that didn't fully align with that version of events. Timing that suggested coordination, decisions that implied influence, and outcomes that benefited people Marcus had never met. Slowly, the picture became clearer. Daniel hadn't been acting entirely on his own. There were others involved, people with experience, people who understood how to structure something like this in a way that would hold up under scrutiny, people who knew exactly how to position Marcus as the central figure while keeping themselves just out of reach. And Daniel, whether by choice or pressure, had stepped into a role within that structure, one that required him to do something far more difficult than deception alone. He had to maintain proximity. He had to stay close enough to ensure everything unfolded as planned, close enough to observe, to confirm, to make sure there were no deviations. That realization reframed everything Marcus thought he understood about the silence, about the moments when Daniel could have intervened but didn't. It wasn't just about guilt or indifference. It was about commitment to something that had already been set in motion, something that may have been impossible to stop once it reached a certain point. But even with that understanding, one question remained heavier than the rest. At any moment, he could have said something. At any point, he could have stepped away. And yet he didn't. Whether it was fear, pressure, or something else entirely, Daniel chose to see it through, to watch it unfold, to stand there as Marcus lost everything piece by piece. Marcus's name was eventually cleared, though not in the way people imagine when they think of justice. It didn't come with a single moment of vindication or a dramatic reversal that erased what had been said about him. It came gradually, through corrections, through findings that shifted responsibility, through acknowledgments that the original narrative had been incomplete. But by then, the damage had already been done. Reputation doesn't return to its original form once it's been broken, and the life Marcus had built couldn't simply be restored because the truth had surfaced. Relationships had changed, opportunities had disappeared, and the sense of certainty he once carried had been replaced with something far more cautious. Daniel Brooks faced consequences as well, though even that felt complicated in ways Marcus hadn't expected. Knowing that Daniel hadn't acted alone didn't erase what he had done. It only added another layer to it, one that made the betrayal feel both personal and part of something larger at the same time. In the end, there was no simple explanation that could tie everything together neatly, no single reason that could fully account for the choices that were made. There were motives, pressures, and influences, but none of them changed the core truth of what had happened between them. For Marcus, the hardest part wasn't rebuilding his life, it was coming to terms with how it all began. Because the more he reflected on everything that had happened, the more he understood that the setup didn't start with the deal or the documents or the night the police showed up. It started much earlier, in moments that felt ordinary at the time, in decisions that seemed harmless, in trust that was given without limits. The setup began the moment he stopped questioning, the moment he believed that loyalty alone was enough to protect him from anything that could go wrong. Some betrayals don't just break your trust, they rewrite your entire life. They change the way you see people, the way you interpret silence, the way you measure honesty. They stay with you, not as a single memory, but as a series of realizations that continue to surface long after the event itself has passed. And even when the truth is known, even when the facts are laid out clearly, there is always a part of it that feels unresolved, a part that lingers in the space between what happened and what could have been different. So now the question isn't just about Marcus Hale or Daniel Brooks, it's about something much closer, something that applies far beyond this story. If your closest friend betrayed you, if the person you trusted more than anyone else became the reason everything fell apart, would you have seen it coming, or would you have believed, just like Marcus did, that some bonds are simply too strong to break until it's already too late? Tell me in the comments, do you think Daniel Brooks ever felt guilty for what he did? Or was this something he accepted long before Marcus Hale ever realized what was happening? Because when you look at everything, the planning, the silence, the way he stayed close while it all unfolded, it raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Guilt usually shows itself in hesitation, in moments where someone pulls back, where they try to undo what's been set in motion. But in this case, those moments never came, or at least they were never visible in a way that could have changed the outcome. So was it all part of the plan from the very beginning, or did something shift along the way that turned loyalty into something else entirely? And if you think the story was shocking, if you believe you've heard the full extent of what trust and betrayal can do to someone's life, then you're not going to want to miss what comes next. Because in the next case, the story doesn't end with the truth coming out or justice finding its way through the chaos. In the next story, the person at the center of it all was never supposed to make it out, and yet somehow, against everything that was planned, they did. And what they uncovered after that will make you question just how far people are willing to go when they believe no one will be left to tell the story.